Welcome to Washington in Focus. I'm your host, TJ Martinell. With me is Carleen Johnson, and we're discussing this week the fact that Seattle police detectives have identified a suspect and referred felony assault charges to the King County Prosecutor's Office against an alleged attacker who brutally assaulted a journalist covering the ICE protests in Seattle. Carleen, what's going on?
Yeah, so it was June 14th that the No King's Day protests were happening all over the country. A lot of folks probably saw some of that in their cities. And independent journalist Cam Higby was covering the protests near the Seattle Department of Homeland Security building, and there was a bunch of Antifa protesters there. The attack, probably a lot of folks saw it. It was all over social media, right? But another journalist, Jonathan Cho, actually captured it on video along with a second journalist, Katie Davis Court. But it was pretty vicious. The way Higby described it to me is he was kind of taking a break because he'd been covering the protests all day. And he's like, I was exhausted, had been on my feet for miles. So kind of went across the street opposite the federal building and kind of had a seat. Now he was kind of himself disguised. This is sort of his MO. He tries to kind of fit in with Antifa, right? So wear the all black, cover your head, do the scarf, kind of fit in with them to infiltrate so that you can accurately portray what they're up to, right? So at one point he said he kind of took off his head covering. He had a helmet on for protection, thank goodness, as it turns out. But in front of the helmet, at one point he also had like a gas mask on and then a clear covering over that. Well, suffice to say they recognized him. And a couple of these Antifa guys, one of them who had threatened Cam's life a few weeks prior, Cam was kind of keeping an eye out for him. So that guy and another person, the one who's now charges have been forwarded to the prosecutor by Seattle police, a guy by the name of Jeremy Lawson.
Yeah.
And you've seen the video. So anyway, they came over and they beat the crumb out of him. I mean, they literally were, hitting him, kicking him, using those, gloves that have the metal in them, basically like brass knuckles, and were repeatedly punching him in the head. I mean, it took big dents and divots out of his helmet. If he hadn't been wearing the helmet, probably would have been far more seriously injured. As it was, he was left with a pretty serious concussion. And finally, the charges filed this week, 10 full days after the attack. But still no arrest of this guy. Mr. Lawson has not yet been taken into custody.
Interesting. So the charge has been filed, but he wasn't arrested?
Right. Well, the charges have been forwarded to the prosecutor's office from the Seattle police detective who took over the case. So Cam instantly called police. He waited 45 minutes for police to come the night of the attack. He wasn't feeling good. He's like, and then Jonathan Cho, who had taken some of the videos, like, dude, don't wait. They're not going to come. There's already not enough cops in Seattle to cover the protests and protect the federal building and all that. So they're not going to come. So he put him in his car, Jonathan Cho's car, and said, let's get you back across town where your car is. And even then in the car, Cam said he already wasn't feeling good. So he went to urgent care that night, and they said, watch for the, signs of a concussion. By the next morning, he woke up with this nosebleed and went to the ER and, was diagnosed with that moderate concussion, and has been kind of pretty miserable since with the nausea and I mean I had a concussion in third grade, and I remember for 6 months every day at school I had to like go lay down for a half an hour because I'd get a massive headache at the same time every day. So I mean, I remember it's not fun. It's kind of amazing
that he could take his whatever head covering he had off for a few moments and people immediately knew who he was.
Yep.
And it's very interesting when media is trying to cover an event and people don't want it to be recorded because they want to control what people see and the point where they're going to attack anybody who records them. And, I get if somebody's being recorded in a very antagonistic way. That's like if somebody's up in your face and, got a camera and you're up, right next to you or is violating personal boundaries. But if they're just filming what's going on and your thought is, I need to attack them, it's probably because you're doing something you shouldn't be doing. And
Yeah.
I think what's also interesting is, we've talked about the Domestic Violent Extremism Task Force. And what's interesting is assaults on the media doesn't seem to be considered a high priority. A big problem where this is somebody this is a direct assault on the First Amendment, the freedom of the press, the ability for people to go out and cover stuff and provide transparency. And people are willing to use violence to do that. That's like me, you think that that's a big deal, that people would say, hey, attacks on media are not okay under any circumstances, but it's almost as if this is just considered normal now. Like this understanding that, because there's been other journalists who've been threatened and put in really bad situations. I know Jonathan Cho has been one of them who's also been attacked. And
multiple times. Yeah.
Right. Let's swap out reporter and put in some other protected group and say, would we consider this? I mean, imagine that if there was violent attacks at pride rallies or pride festivals or wherever,
right,
the people being attacked. Isn't it interesting how, why isn't being a member of the press a protected identity under our hate crime laws? Like, oh, you're a reporter, we should be able to, we're going to go attack you because you're a member of the press. As opposed to, say, if I went and thought some guy was not white and I attacked him because I perceived him to be non-white, that would be a hate crime. So why wouldn't we have protections for members of the press?
Right. That's a really, really good point. I mean, I've been at some of these protests, even like a month ago, the one that was the faith groups that were, themselves attacked in Seattle. And then a few days later, had the event in front of Seattle City Hall, and that got really ugly to a point where I couldn't get back to where our vehicle was parked. Thankfully, my husband was with me to protect me, but even police were like, "No, you can't go this way, go that way." And I'm like, and as soon as they saw I was a member of the press, I was hurled vile, I should say, insults at me. I was never physically assaulted by anybody, but the fact this is interesting. The fact it took 10 days to recommend charges. And by the way, Cam Higby does not blame the Seattle Police Department at all, any way, shape, or form. He's like, the detective has been all over this from day one, but they were also very real with him and said, we can forward the charges. Then it's up to the prosecutor's office to decide, if they've got enough information. But let's look at what they've got, TJ. They've got multiple videos identifying things on, Mr. Lawson's person, including face tattoos, arm tattoos. He's got some Antifa tattoos on one side. They've got, I think Cam submitted as evidence a photo of some tennis shoes that were, remarkably identifiable, and that Mr. Lawson, the suspect, had posted to social media weeks before. Look at my cool new tennis shoes. Well, he happened to be wearing those tennis shoes the night of the attack, and those were seen. They forwarded information about where he lives in Monroe, his recent places of employment, all kinds of social media posts where he has threatened others at some of these ICE protests. So there is literally a mountain of evidence, and the investigating officer said, you've got a Loctite case here, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the prosecutor will go ahead and bring the charges. Either way, at this point, the forwarding, the suggestion of charges, the recommendation from the investigating officer should be enough to bring this guy in handcuffs. So they won't tell me at this point whether or not Seattle police won't, if in fact, they have attempted to locate him or make an arrest. They said that's information I can request. I have put in the public records request. You're all too familiar with those delays.
Well, and let's think about the ramifications if these charges are not filed. That's effectively giving him and this Antifa individual and others like him effectively a implicit approval from the county to commit acts of violence against the press. And honestly, if the evidence is that overwhelming, that's where if it were me, I would be making phone calls at the federal level and saying, this is not just, this is where it's almost being endorsed by local governments, and where you have state sponsored or state enabled violence against members of the press in violation of their First Amendment rights. I mean, this is this is where I could see the Fed saying, hey, we're considering this to be collusion, where you're allowing private citizens to commit acts of violence against media to prevent them from covering events. And on top of that, these are violent protests to prevent federal law enforcement officers from enforcing
the law.
And media who are trying to cover these violent protests are being attacked. That can open up some pretty strong, I'd say it's a very the stakes are high, I think is the best way to put it, where you have and I think that's something that the county should probably, the prosecutor will want to think about is, do they really want to send the message that it is okay to potentially, because the next time it might not just be an injury, it might be somebody getting killed.
Well, and is it going to take that? All right. If they don't, I mean, the recommended charge in this case is second degree assault. It is a felony. It would be punishable by some major jail time, assuming everything goes through and the prosecutor holds the charge at the level it's at now. But you mentioned getting the feds involved. Now, the same night, June 14th, the No Kings protests that were going on all over, they also took place at the Immigration Center facility in Tukwila, right? And independent journalist Brandy Cruz with the Undivided podcast, she was at that event, and you've seen the video too. She also was assaulted, chased down by these groups, and had basically wasp killer sprayed into her eyes. I mean, and when I spoke to her, days later, she said it was just the day before that her eyes had stopped burning. They burned for like 5 days. I mean, that could do serious damage, to your sight. And so she has also filed a police report with Tukwila PD. Haven't heard if there's going to be any recommendation for charges there, but Brandy has a lot of contacts at the federal level, and she has already been in touch. She didn't name any folks, but says that definitely the feds are looking at what happened here, not only to her, but to Cam. And like you say, the attacks on journalists just trying to cover, as law enforcement, federal officials attempt to enforce the law. So I think they're paying attention.
I seem to recall a prior time in American history where people were basking themselves in committing terrorist acts against people to prevent them from exercising their rights. To the feds had to pass a federal law specifically for dealing with those groups of people. Hopefully we don't have to get to that point, but that seems to be where and those groups were also being enabled at the state level. So you almost wonder if history doesn't repeat itself, but I think the saying is it rhymes or something like that. So
it's a scary time. And I hope something's going to come of this. And I really do hope, like you say, if they don't follow through, the prosecutor's office doesn't follow through, King County prosecutor, by the way, with charges in this case, they better have some explaining to do, because with the mountain of evidence that is there would be no reason not to follow through with a violent assault on an independent journalist. This is one we're going to be following closely. And,
So definitely we'll be keeping a close eye on this one. So listeners can keep up with this and other stories at thecentersquare.com. I'm your host, TJ Martinell, and thanks for listening.